Welcome to Taking Stock. I'm Amanda Lang. Coming up, banks are quick to raise borrowing costs as rates rise, but interest on savings remain at rock bottom levels. And from non-residents buying homes to a record backlog of immigrants, the forces that will shape the housing market. Plus, planning on extreme, how the insurance industry is grappling with climate events. That's all ahead. First, though, for the week that was in business, it's time for the briefs. The Canadian economy shed 30,600 jobs in July as the unemployment rate remained at a record low of 4.9%. After recovering all of the jobs lost in the pandemic, Canada has seen a record number of unfilled jobs. Meanwhile, almost as many people left the workforce in July as positions were lost. The U.S. added more than 500,000 jobs in July, finally recovering its pandemic job losses. For housing, the story seems to be more of the same, with volume of sales plummeting in Canada's biggest markets in July, while prices softened again. In Toronto, home sales dropped 47% in the month of July compared to a year ago. Prices are now 19% below their February peak. That's the biggest four-month decline in more than 20 years. Vancouver showed similar drops, while Calgary fared slightly better. Sales there declined 3% year over year, and the average price is now just 0.6% above year-ago levels. Ongoing staffing issues at hospitals is forcing more of them to close departments or reduce their hours, with 25 hospitals in Ontario reportedly scaling back on the long weekend. Ontario's premier said the system is still working and that the province will add more internationally trained healthcare workers to ease the burden.
We're throwing everything in the kitchen sink at this, and we're going to continue doing that to make sure that we have the proper healthcare that people require.
But healthcare leaders say retention of existing staff is the key issue as burnout rates continue to send workers to the sidelines. The problem isn't confined to hospitals. A lack of family doctors had one BC woman advertising in the newspaper for a doctor who might fill her husband's prescriptions. With travel season in Canada in full swing, Air Canada posted a five-fold increase in its revenue to $3.9 billion. It is far from immune, though, to the problems dogging travel. Airport delays prompted Air Canada to cut 15% of its summer schedule, or 9,500 flights. And higher costs, including for jet fuel, mean Air Canada is still operating at a loss, $253 million in the most recent 3 months. You might say they're feeling like they're customers. They're flying, but it's not as fun as it used to be. Meanwhile, Airbnb proved it can adapt to a post-lockdown world just fine, with record revenue and promises of more to come. For customers, the number what to focus on may be the average daily rate, which at $164 US per night was a 40% increase over 2019 levels. The company also swung to a profit with 104 million nights booked between April and June. And those are your business briefs. Well, as interest rates rise, so do borrowing costs. In fact, the banks are pretty quick to raise their rates after the central bank does. They are not so quick to touch the return they offer on savings, so your deposits are still well under the rate of inflation. It seems obvious that savers who've suffered for years in a low-rate world should finally be rewarded, but not so far. Natasha Macmillan is the director of everyday banking at Ratehub.ca. Thanks for being with us.
Hi there. Thanks for having me.
So it seems kind of striking, actually. We would expect, and we've seen mortgage rates climb higher, all credit lines climb higher, and yet that rate you get on your deposits, the money you give to the bank, and they get to keep it against all of their loans, really hasn't budged. In some cases, not at all, and in some cases, it's still below 1%. Why don't the banks, do you think, do better about moving that rate up?
So Canadians did actually a lot of savings throughout the pandemic, and so there isn't significant pressure for them to actually increase these rates on the deposit side. So they do have a lot of cash and liquidity. Where we might be seeing some more competition are on the GIC front or high interest savings accounts, where credit unions and smaller online institutions are putting additional pressure on the big banks to increase those rates. But again, still, as you mentioned, very minimal on the saving side for those Canadians seeking to save a little extra.
Yeah, so this is a key point that you're making. They don't need to attract us, I guess, is the point. They're kind of awash in cash themselves, so they don't need our savings, particularly. They don't need to lure us there. Does that raise the issue of if there were better or more competition, we would get better rates on our savings? Is there any evidence that that's the case?
Absolutely. What we've been seeing is credit unions do provide a better alternative for savers. So they have higher interest rates on their high interest savings accounts and their GICs than the big banks. And ideally, as the pressure increases and Canadians start to move with brands they're less familiar with, that will start to increase the competitive competition and competitive pressure for the big banks. And ideally, that will force them to kind of move their rates in line with the market.
We do see when mortgage rates go up, Natasha, it's always a bit striking. The biggest Canadian banks, they kind of do it in lockstep. It's all in the same afternoon. It's all to exactly the same place. It does feel cozy is the word, I guess, that comes to mind. You know they are competing for every mortgage they get, but they seem happy to all settle at the same rate. Again, do we need to look to smaller players, independent players, newcomers to try to kind of upset that cozy relationship?
On the lending side, the big banks and kind of smaller providers typically move their rates in lockstep, as you mentioned, with the Bank of Canada. Again, that's very different on the saving sides, but typically they kind of move in lockstep when you're looking at lending rates.
So if we're asking this question of shouldn't savers be rewarded now that the banks are making more on the money they lend out, there's obviously not a straight equation, but is there somewhere we would look? Is it the government? Is there a regulator? Is there some consumer body that would say to the banks, hey, you're kind of ripping people off right now. If you're going to make more on mortgages, you should actually give people more on their deposits?
Unfortunately, it's really up to Canadians to kind of do their intel and their research and put the competitive pressure on their banks and the banking system we have here. So really highly advise that Canadians go out and kind of do a review of the rates that are available to them and perhaps go with a name they're less known with. And less perhaps comfortable. They all have regulations and are governed by a regulatory body. But it does, there is a little bit of uncertainty for Canadians going with names that they're less aware of. And so it is something like that they should really go out and do their research, start to see where they can get the best bang for their buck.
Thanks for being with us, Natasha. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Natasha Macmillan is Director of Everyday Banking at Ratehub.ca. Coming up, the debate about how much foreign ownership is shaping our housing market has a new thread. Some of those owners own multiple homes. Stay with us.